Let's welcome to the studio now our Africa expert, Ayo Johnson. And Ayo, just reflecting on the pictures we're seeing there in Johannesburg and that legend in that tablet there, it's in our hands now. Clearly people are thinking about this already. They've had time to prepare themselves and to think about the future, even though they've perhaps not wanted it to happen this way. What will they do with his legacy?
I think his legacy is already written, it's already said and done. Mandela was about democracy, he was about equality, he was about freedom, and he was about reconciliation. And it's that word reconciliation that the entire world will remember him for, because he said he'll forgive, he said he'll forget, he will focus on the future, not the past. Those are the signs of remarkable individuals, and he clearly stands above many that have come and passed.
Yeah, Jacob Zuma, indeed, in the address to the nation, talking of a life spent in the service of his country, in the cause of humanity, and a truly united South Africa. But should we have perhaps a note of caution as well, that it still has huge problems to overcome that perhaps Mandela himself recognised and knew of?
Well, coming out of prison in 1990 and, of course, becoming the first president in 1994, South Africa is a young democracy. We must recognise that it's only 20 years on. Are we expecting too much? The challenges are there: poverty, inequality, a housing issue, not to mention crime. Yes, these are already, but nonetheless, South Africa is a superpower on the African continent. And for that reason, Mandela's name, his legacy, what he stood for, is the insurance policy that guaranteed the ANC and the development and the democracy we have today.
Would he have wanted things, though, to have moved at a faster rate than they have?
Wanting, hoping, wishing, maybe. But what we have is that the pace of change has been slightly slow, not as fast as many would have expected. The expectation levels were pushed too high to start with. And a young democracy, nonetheless, people are expecting more. They should.
What about these pictures we're seeing from Johannesburg? We've got Alex there, who's obviously been updating us on these scenes outside the family house in Houghton in Johannesburg. Some people may find it very odd to see these scenes of celebration, as it appears.
In African terms, it doesn't really matter who it is. Mandela being as great as he is, if you're over 90, have lived a life of respect, you're celebrated. You're celebrated about the fact that you've lived a life for which people remarkably admire. And that's what you're seeing on the scenes now. So it's not normal from a perspective, from a Western perspective, but nonetheless, from an African perspective, it's pretty normal. People celebrate when you've achieved, when you've literally lived your life, be that Mandela sacrificed so much of that life, but nonetheless lived it to this full.
Okay, we will come back to you in just a moment or... We heard from Desmond Tutu. He said he taught us how to come together and to believe in ourselves and each other. Ayo Johnson is with us here in the studio. Greatest statesman of the 20th century?
Possibly. I mean, Nobel Peace Prize winner, an ambassador by the UN, an icon across the entire African continent. In fact, he was knighted by the Queen in England here. Many other titles around the world. There are very few leaders who've been respected enough to get all these sort of titles and acclaim. And to that extent, I think Mandela stands slightly above so many others.
His health deteriorated, not least because he spent such a long time in jail, and yet he still managed to travel around the world when he became president, representing the people of South Africa and what he, along with others, had managed to achieve.
Well, his health suffered since he was in prison. It's literally been his Achilles heel. But nonetheless, he didn't let it distract him from the core, which is about leading his people, reconciling with his people, the wider South Africa, and becoming the statesman which he had to make those engagements and travel overseas, which he did robustly in respect of his health. And the fact that he found love even after he had left Winnie Mandela and moved on. So those are the signs of a person who's not selfish, a man who's clearly not greedy, a man who's very focused on the agenda. And above all, he stood for president only once, one term, and he thought that that was enough for him to reconcile, stand back and allow Thabo Mbeki and of course Motlanthe and of course Zuma that we have now to take over. And each one of them have sought his counsel, sought his experience, sought his guidance. So it's crucial.
He found contentment with his third wife, as you were saying. His health deteriorated significantly over the last 5 years of his life. What impact, what control, what effect do you think he had on the country during those final 5 years of his life?
The final 5 years were concern, alarm, how is South Africa going to cope, coming to terms with the fact that he may not be with us any further. Is South Africa's got enough of a structure? Have they matured enough? A lot of people were concerned that there may be violence, the minority white population may be put at risk, but all of that's clearly not come to pass. So it shows a South Africa that has matured, a South Africa that has evolved, a South Africa that's 20 years on through democracy, and a South Africa that's in a better place internationally, regionally, throughout the entire African continent, not to mention South Africa itself.
You talk about democracy, but it's been an uneasy peace of late, not only between blacks and whites in South Africa, but also between those within his own party.
Yes, the ANC is not the movement it once wanted in terms of solidarity, unity, it's split. What you would expect that. It's 20 years of a democratically elected ANC with a series of precedents that have followed. And to that extent, there are questions as to whether they've been able to address the fundamentals, which were poverty levels coming down, the top down in terms of income distribution, which hasn't happened, the fact that many of the youth feel disorientated, isolated, irrespective of the fact that South Africa is a very better place than it was previously. But the expectation levels are that much more higher. So to that extent, the South African economy, being a superpower on the African continent, doing so well, the expectation levels are that the government can do so much more for its people. And to that extent, places like Soweto, still impoverished, people still living below the poverty line. Why? In a country which is deemed to be done so much better. So there's this contradiction between the South Africa that's done well with the numbers, South Africa that have not been able to do the trickle down in terms of wealth distribution, and a people who are asking for more.
And what do you think his passing what impact that will have on that uneasy peace that's in place at the moment?
Well, Madiba, as he's called, South Africa is seen as the grandfather, the ultimate father of the entire ANC revolution. And to that extent, the people understand they can come to terms. His name alone brought peace. His name alone made sure there was no fighting. His name alone and the words that came out of his mouth made sure that South Africa was put back on the right path. I think even if South Africa has troubled times in the future...
Do you think it will?
Well, it's got challenging times. Sure. It's going through a crossroads. I believe it's slightly more mature than it was in 1990. I think it's evolved as a people. I think they're much more united. But the challenges, as you just rightfully expressed, are still there, and that can come back to bite it. How it responds, how Zuma responds, how the people itself and the expectations levels, do they start questioning more of their leaders, which they clearly are? How much more is it going to rain on the police force that seem to have an open hand these days in venting its frustration against the people and the population at large? These are some of the crucial issues. And of course, the crime issue, which as a whole has got to be curtailed. These are very challenging times for South Africa. But nonetheless, South Africa has done well economically.
Thank you very much indeed for now. You're watching Sky News.
Now we have